Good morning, everyone. We're just waiting as people come into the room. Welcome, welcome. Yeah, we're going to get started in just a few moments. We're just allowing everybody to get in. Okay, I'll just a couple more seconds and then we'll just get started. Hello, everyone. Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I see we have people joining us from all around the world today, participants and speakers. We thank you all for joining us as FIU Cyber and collaboration with Florida Memorial University presents The Future of the Work Dynamic in the East and West, a post-COVID analysis. My name is Jillian Avendano, and I'm the program director at FIU's Center for International Business Education and Research. I'm joined here by my colleague, our graduate assistant, Mr. Marcos Santos. I don't know if you want to say hello, Marcos.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. And we are, so basically what Cyber is that we're one of 15 centers throughout the US, which operates thanks to a Title VI grant from the US Department of Education. Our main goal is to promote US competitiveness in international business. And we do so by offering programming and opportunities for students, faculty, and the community to grow their knowledge in this field and in the field of international education. So today we're joined by 3 dynamic speakers who have many years of experience working in or consulting for major international companies in the US and Asia. And I'm excited because today they're going to share their perspective and their experience on this very timely topic and in doing a comparison of the work life in the East and the West. And so joining us from San Francisco, we have Ms. Daria Istrom. She has received her MBA from Harvard Business School, and she works in biotech commercial strategy for Genentech. So she's been doing consulting at Roland Berger and IQVIA for 6 years, or she had done that for 6 years. She's also the co-author of a book called Work of the Future, Rethinking Asia 7. Next, and then I'll also invite them to speak a little bit more about themselves and their experience once they take the floor. We have Mr. Alex Cater. He also has an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the founder and principal of Cater Investment Group. He has over 10 years of experience in consulting with Kearney and Booz, Allen Hamilton in finance. He's a sector expertise in tech, biotechnology, and financial services. He also teaches as a professor at the Florida Memorial University here in Florida. But today he's joining us from the beautiful country of Panama. Next, we have Mr. Mahesh Bhatt. He has an MBA from the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. He's tuning in from Bangkok, Thailand. And he is the head of business innovation group at Samsung Electronics. He has 15 years in multinational experience and management consulting, strategy, and operations. And they all are connected in that they've worked together, either in Korea or, here in the US. So without further ado, I welcome them to go ahead and share their screen and present to us. Yeah, hold on. And there we go. You should have access now. And I'm sorry. I wanted to also mention that we will have a time for Q&A at the end, but feel free to drop your questions there. And we will try to get to as many questions as possible. Or if you would just like to, talk to other people, feel free to write in the chat. It would be great to hear where everyone is coming from and what their area of expertise is or interest.
Thanks for the intro, Jelly, and really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining here. Um, it's wonderful to be here and to talk with you about this wonderful topic that I think we'll have three unique perspectives on to be able to kind of approach and kind of share on that perspective. So just a few things just to kick off before we touch base. One is that feel free, as mentioned, feel free to drop questions in the chat box. And there'll also be follow-up surveys if I'm not mistaken. Please participate. Love to get the feedback. Love to understand your thoughts on the session and how we can make it better. Feel free to obtain a copy of the slide presentation afterwards. In case we have any tech issues, I think that we're pretty set with the wonderful people at FIU and the tech department helping us. But in case there is, please bear with us. And then finally, enjoy the content. So just to give you an overview before turning it over to Daria, who'll lead us off. We'll spend about 35 minutes, give or take, in terms of just kind of going through some content that we've prepared for you. And then we'll have some Q&A time that's dedicated for a Q&A section to kind of address your questions. And of course, if there's anything else that comes up that are pertinent, that we can also fill them there. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Daria.
Thank you, Alex and Jillian, for the introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. And I saw in the chat box that you started posting where everyone is joining from. I'm very impressed by all the locations and people that we have on the line. And I bet each one of us is coming from different industries, different geographies. So this is going to make for a great discussion today that I'm looking forward to. Great. So my presentation will start with a few lessons from COVID-19. And unfortunately, as we all know, COVID-19 is an ongoing thing. But really, like, for the past year and a half, we've been able to come up with some learnings and best practices in terms of business environment and how we operate at work. And that's what I'm looking forward to sharing with you today. So some of them may seem obvious now. They were not obvious a year and a half ago. Work from home is here to stay in one form or another, right? I think depending on our industries, some of us have been at work, some others are still 100% work from home, and for some others, we're heading towards a kind of a hybrid model, but just compared to what we experienced before March of 2020, work from home is here to stay in one form or another. And that really triggers my second point here, that business as usual is not an option. So based on how we conduct business, how we communicate with each other, these fundamental principles have changed, which triggers a disruptive change in the way we do business. And really, that's really the clock that you see on the right-hand side. It's time for change for all of us at all levels within an organization. And then just to wrap it up here on an optimistic note, it is time for change, but it's also at the same time, this provides an opportunity to rethink the way we conduct business. And so I think it's up to each one of us, no matter where we work, what level in the organization, or maybe we started our own company, but for all of us, this is an opportunity to take a step back and contemplate for a while, just like our new environment, how we're interacting with each other, how we're communicating, and rethinking the way we do business. And so for my next slides, I'll just talk through a couple of examples here. Yeah, I had a quote from Jack Welch, and it's very much along the lines of what I was saying before. This is not a marathon, it's a sprint. I think in the beginning, we thought it would be a marathon, given also the amount of changes that came our way. But but it's really, well, hopefully it's not going to take 10 to 15 years, but it's been months and months now. So we're just adapting to the new normal and to the new everyday. But we need to keep that innovation, that innovative spirit going, and bring that to work every day. So that's something that each one of us is experiencing during COVID. So yeah, I just have a couple of examples here, and I'm sure you have more examples from the news in terms of how different corporations, small and large and local and regional and multinational, how they responded to the pandemic in terms of work from home arrangements. Depending on the industry as well, some of the tech giants like Microsoft and Twitter, they kind of they just moved the entire work from home. Some others adopted a more hybrid model. On the next slide, I'm bringing an example from Asia. Alice, can we move to the next slide, please? I'm bringing an example from Asia where Mondelez International, so this being a manufacturer, a global manufacturer with manufacturing capabilities that are physical, from the get-go, they implemented this hybrid model where part of the team was working from home and the rest of the team was going into the lab or the factory. And again, depending on the industry that you're working in, I know you must have experienced different setups like this, and we had to stay flexible. And we continue to be that way. On the bright side, the quote that we have here, there's also efficiencies to be made because especially in terms of cost savings and physical space and all of that, and a more personal level stuff like commuting time. But taking into account all the benefits, it's still very disruptive, right, in the way we do business every day. So in my next few slides, I just want to kind of walk through some best practices and things that each one of us, we can implement in our day-to-day work. And hopefully these learnings, I know that some of them you must have already gone through, but maybe some of the learnings here will spark some insight or something actionable that you want to implement in your day-to-day work. And hopefully this will just help us adapt better along the way. So in the following slides, we'll just take each point one by one and we'll detail it. But so here, where do we begin? Building okay, I'll just summarize it first. Building a community of trust. So that's super important. It's important at any point in time in any type of business environment, but how do you do that? How do you achieve that in a virtual environment? Maybe with colleagues that you haven't met in person ever. So the dynamics are completely changed here. The second point there is, how do we enhance virtual communication? As we'll see, virtual communication is not ideal. It cannot trump a face-to-face type of interaction, but how do we adapt to that? And how do we make the most out of it? The third point is super important, and many articles have been written about it, supporting employee well-being. I think, as we all know, just working from home for like a week or two is something, but when it becomes a year and 2 years, and just like having to adapt to this, it affects our overall well-being. So a little bit more on that. And finally, how do we manage to develop a collaborative environment even in this virtual setting? It's not easy, right? I think we all recognize it's definitely more complicated than it used to be before, but it's not impossible. And we have examples to support that. So let's move on to the next slide and talk about how we can build a community of trust that transcends virtual environments and supports continuous development. So some of these techniques we used to do before, in a face-to-face environment. But now the question is, how do we adapt it for virtual? So like happy hours, depending on your company, I used to have a lot of happy hours, like on a Friday afternoon, the team would get together in a more informal type of setting just to get to know each other. For the longest time now, these haven't been possible. So we just transitioned to virtual happy hours, which are definitely not as fun as the ones in person, but they're a good substitute for, you know, like the next best action that we can take. And that goes with offsites too. We had examples of like cooking classes and survival classes, and there are many companies that offer these type of interactions online, and they send you ingredients at home, just something that you can do with your team to build that team spirit. And then one last thing that I would like to emphasize, and I know we all come from different cultures and different geographies, but I think this may not be like what you're used to doing, but I think it's super important whenever we have like video calls or just like calls with the team, to take a step back and just allocate maybe even if only 5 minutes at the beginning of the meeting, just talking about personal updates. Maybe if the meeting is on a Monday, talk about what happened over the weekend. And that just makes the whole interaction more personal. Otherwise, it's just business, very focused on the problem at hand. And we want to avoid that. I mean, business, like talking about business is good. That's the main objective ultimately, but also getting to know your teammates and showing that you care, developing that personal relationship. And it sounds like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not a lot of time allocated to these type of like small chit chat or personal updates, and it makes a great impact. Next, how do we enhance communication in the virtual environment? So I was saying that you see here the first bullet point is on a scale of what's most desirable to least desirable. In person, of course, it's like the best option, but the option that we don't really have right now. And then at the other extreme, you have written communication. So I think at the beginning of the pandemic, many of us switched from it was like a very abrupt switch from in-person to a lot of emails. There was a lot of research done in terms of how people just started being more in front of their computer, and the amount of just like the volume of emails increased a lot. So these are two different extremes, but there's also in the middle, we have video and audio communication. And now with all the software solutions that we have available to us, including this, the wonderful Zoom meeting that Jillian set up for us and Marco set up for us today, it makes it possible for us to interact in a different way. So there's some middle ground where you can actually hear each other. You can even see each other. And I know it's not always comfortable to have your camera on for many hours every day, but it does make a difference. And such as Zoom, they're like other WebEx, Google Hangouts, depending on what you want to use. So I would encourage you, even if it feels like it's a bit outside of our comfort zone, to still try, maybe like start with a few meetings where you turn on your camera and just interact more with your teammates. So next slide, the well-being one of my favorite ones here. So depending on the organization that you're in, usually bigger organizations have more resources to offer virtual coaches and training sessions. But I think nowadays there are so many free resources online as well that we can all access. And there are specific topics of interest for during the pandemic, so that apply directly to a business environment. So for example, how to conduct a virtual presentation, right? Like we didn't really have to do this before. Maybe we would do it once in a while, every 6 months with some folks across the country, but we were not in a position to do it every single day. Now this is how we conduct our business. how to lead a virtual team, right? Like how to motivate employees that are not in the same location as you are, and how to, that's why I think connecting on a personal level, it's important to just get to know that person and understand where they're coming from. And how finally how to communicate effectively online. So a lot of these things, you can find classes, free classes, and articles online. And I think because it's so different from what we were used to doing before, I think everyone could benefit from some structured learning in terms of how you can do these things. And maybe hopefully that way you can also shine and get ahead at work if you master these skills in a virtual environment. And then on the more spiritual side, meditation and yoga classes that could be part of your daily routine. Again, I think this, for example, my company offers these classes, and it's just such a nice way to either start or wrap up your day with. And it's just a change in your daily schedule, something that you can look forward to. So I would encourage you exploring those options as well. And then next slide, how can we continue to be collaborative and develop high quality work and ensure the long-term viability of this new work model? So again, this is here to stay. It's not a week or two. Our performance evaluations, the career progression will depend on our performance during this time. So this is for managers as well as individual contributors alike, but we need to find new ways of reporting, tracking our performance. We need to set realistic milestones that they would look different than the milestones that we would have set before. But they need to be realistic, and it needs to be something that we're working towards. Very much, the objective is very similar to what we had before, to have a deadline, to work with structured timelines, to be able to track our performance. And I think above everything else, also making sure that we schedule regular and even more frequent check-ins than what we used to have before, because in a virtual environment, it's really easy to just talk about the business as at hand, and not kind of be focused on very detailed actions that we take every day, and then kind of losing track of the bigger picture. So we need to make sure, we need to have that bigger picture. We need to think about this long term, about our performance, about how we're collaborative. And also, yeah, Jillian, I like that picture too. I think it's you know, like recognizing that each one of us has a different setting at home, parents, kids who don't go into daycare, all of that. So just cutting them some slack, or just understanding, again, getting to know people on a personal level and getting to know their families and where they're coming from. So I think this is almost the end of my presentation, but I do have a framework that I would like to leave you with. And you may have seen this before. It's really simple. It's the start, stop, and continue framework. But I think it would be really great if you could take maybe even just 5 minutes after this session today to just think through what are the activities that you want to start doing that you were not doing before, such as setting aside time for personal updates or organizing a virtual happy hour. What are the things that you want to stop doing? Maybe we were used to doing these things in a pre-COVID environment. Like I remember in my company, we would just have these working sessions or workshops that would go on for hours, from 4 to 8 hours, like 2-3 days a week. That's not it's not possible in a virtual environment, and you may have to just break it down into smaller time slots and just make it more manageable. So what are the things that you want to stop doing? And then finally, what do we want to continue doing? Something that works right now for us and that we want to keep doing, such as for example, in a hybrid environment, maybe encourage travel to the headquarters or to wherever the team is on a regular basis so that people can meet each other in person from time to time, or continue expanding into new forms of communication, including video. So the actual insights will look different for each one of us, but I think this is a good way to just, again, take a step back and just realize the new environment around us and proactively say, this is what we want to stop doing, this is what we want to continue or start doing. And I think that will benefit each one of us. And this should not be a one-time type of exercise, but as you're learning more, as maybe you're 100% work from home now, and in the future, in like 2 months, you're going to be in a hybrid environment. So as things change, try to come back to this framework and to plan and structure your transition according to your new reality, and that's always changing now. So yeah, these were some of my thoughts on the work from home, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and how we can answer them. But for now, I'll just hand it over to Alex. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, Daria. Definitely appreciate that insight for the concept of how you laid that out, and couldn't agree more. And I know that there's maybe a little bit interesting. I know that we're on a webinar here, and that there's some, Florida is interesting because there's a lot of things going on with people going back to school, back to work. But even as a Florida-based company, there's still, at least on the public side, there's still a lot of things that are still remote, and so still things that I still have to adjust for. But just kind of going into this, what I want to do is kind of get you a concept that, you know, COVID happened. There are some thoughts that if we're already post-COVID, which, you know, I don't know if we can necessarily say that, especially looking at the broader spectrum of things. But what I want to do is kind of give a context of where we were in terms of how work had been transitioning leading up to 2020, and where we are looking at beyond, to give some indication about where we're going here in the next few years, and how COVID has probably influenced that, probably a trajectory that we were already on a little bit in terms of exacerbating that potentially. And then also give you some case studies directly. I'll call Mahesh to also chime in as well with that, with some perspectives, because I think that we may have some different perspectives about not only what's happening in the US, but as we have people coming here from around the world, particularly how it would be presented itself and manifesting itself, these differences in Asian cultures in the East, which is, as you all are probably well aware, are trajectory and becoming more relevant on a global stage. But going on, just kind of starting on where we are in terms of COVID and what we were looking at, if we just go back to business concepts, you know, as professors and students, you all probably all know this and heard of the concept and the term, a phrase of location, 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 right? You know, it's a concept of being based somewhere, making sure that you have a prime real estate asset where you're able to garner foot traffic, garner your customers, meet them where they are. And that's definitely still relevant in many cases, particularly when you have a startups, when you have your local chains, your Pollo Tropicals, your McDonald's. There's a lot of different things that that still have to adhere to that, and making sure that you're based in the right location in order to attract your customers in, right? That's true for production based industries as well. As we're talking about, we're in the midst of a supply chain crunch across the board. One can't talk about the fact that location still matters in terms of being able to supply people. But also, it's just generally talking about being based where you are, but from a white collar perspective, where people who are going into business fields office workers and things like that. It was still making sure that you had prime real estate, either if it was going to be in New York, in Manhattan, if it's going to be in Miami, going to be, somewhere in Bayside, being right in prime real estate and prime location mattered the most, right? And that location has started to shift a little bit, whether or not it's online, but still, having a brick and mortar presence. But over the last decade, from 2010, 2020, it started to shift in terms of the prevalence of location and flexibility. And what that means is that, there had been an emergence of things like co-working spaces, making sure that we don't necessarily have to have the biggest footprint. And I think that, before the call, we talked about, professors that traveled, back and forth, not necessarily being on campus. I mean, I'm also an example of that as well. But, in Washington, D.C. metro area, which is about the same size population-wise as the greater Miami, Fort Lauderdale area, working towards hoteling. So instead of having a massive footprint and these government contractors that have 40,000 people who come on site to a specific place in Northern Virginia, it moved to having, smaller offices across the DC metro area that you don't have to travel 2 hours to get into the office. You can go somewhere close by. And then even as growth continued, to just having hotel spaces. So when it was necessary for you to come in, that you didn't have a dedicated desk, but you could find a place to plug in and work. And of course, as we all are aware of the WeWorks, the spaces that have come up, where not just startups, but also larger mid-market companies that garner offices in these spaces where they don't necessarily need their space. Why? Because it would be a cost advantage to leverage a co-working space and not to have to take on that additional expense and working there, and give people additional culture and a better element and location for them to come work without having that large footprint. But now, 2020 beyond, there's several things that I think we want to phrase into this in terms of what's next, and that's the concept of location, analytics, and experience. And break that down into two parts. One of which is a fusion of workplace and personal space, right? So it's like work where you live, but also work and play where you live, right? It's about being able to bring yourself into a work dynamic, be able to enjoy a work experience. It was what Daria just talked about having, social elements within the office environment, aside just happy hour, but in terms of things that you actually enjoy doing. And I guess one of the gold standards of something like that would be Google, right? That had that an entity that we're bringing in a lot of different activities into the workspace and different fun things like that. But basically what that focuses on is how are you most productive? How will you be able to leverage your creativity, your productivity wherever you are? It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be in the office. And you'll see different companies, particularly in the California front, that have led that initiative to say, you don't have to be in the office at all. And that was a temporary start through this year or early next year that has been made permanent, that you can choose to work in the Himalayas or you can be in the Rockies, as long as you are working where you're most productive, which is one of the concepts that Dropbox and some others have followed suit with, which is appealing to a lot of employees. So it's that ability to leverage your tech or your physical and digital assets where you are. But then the other piece of that is the experimental job design. So as people leaders, as people who are supporting processes, regardless of where you are in the organizational structure, we can create roles for you and ability for you to contribute without actually being in person. Now, that does nothing to say that, there's a sheer replacement. There are certain intangibles that are gained from being in person, but the fact of the matter, being able to put in the ways in which people interact, the way in which they work together, doesn't necessitate that they be right next to each other. And that's one of the biggest changes that we're looking at here post-COVID, post-2020, as you look at companies that are starting to get back into quote unquote business as usual is not really business as usual. It's a concept of being able to be more open to more remote work roles, and then also just changing the way in which the business model operates. And that's another key component of that. And making sure that however you're operating, whatever that the way in which teams are collaborating and working together, adheres to the branding that the company is trying to promote both internally to its employees, as well as that brand story that is conveying to the population and the public at large. So those are just a few things that are important to look at. And as we look at COVID, you see more and more of these things happening across the board. Now, just to give you a little bit more flavor and context to this, I think that it's really important to just bring in a sample about a big difference between the Asian cultures and Eastern society versus the West, right? And I think that there's a few different elements that are pretty sizable. So in this example, we're going to take a example from Korea and the US, right? Because effectively, just to set a context here, there's just inherently different ways in which these companies in Eastern country and Western culture evaluate work and success, right? So in the East, it's primarily hours on site. It's driven by FaceTime. So making sure that your collective, the team is working together, that they're on site together. It's really, if you think about a football team, you're always in that face. You have to be there. So it's kind of that same mentality. When you go to lunch, everyone goes to lunch together. And that concept of how influence is gained is really by being in proximity, and that team leader being right with the team and being able to oversee that team and guide that team. In the US or in Western societies, we talk about being more milestone based, right? And even though that has been, regardless sometimes in terms of that means being in the office, because we've used to be in the office, the fact of the matter is that you still need to make sure that you're delivering. And if you're leaving early to do that, that has been a priority over just literally having FaceTime. And instead of focusing on team dynamics, we focus on individual accomplishments. Yeah, we have to show that what we actually contribute to the team and how do we make a difference. And then it's not necessarily physical proximity that dictates that power dynamic, but rather the organizational structure. How many people do I have on my team? You probably are fully aware of examples where we have a manager or a team leader who sits in Hartford, Connecticut, and the team is based in Tampa. And then they have people who are based in Gurgaon, India, right? So all of those concepts provide a difference in terms of the way that the things have worked. And so the reason why this is different is because remote work existed in some capacity in the West. It wasn't relevant. It wasn't foresight. It was that COVID basically mandated that happen for non-essential workers, but it didn't virtually exist at all in the Korean context, right? And then so the evaluation of being able to determine achievement had to change in terms of how do we evaluate success, and being more open to doing that from a work from home kind of context or a remote work context. And so the prevalence of COVID, even though there's a lot of transition moving back to normal, even faster than in the US. And when I say normal, relatively to the US, in Asian cultures where, COVID was first cited and most prevalent because of, containment, there's still been a lot of changes in terms of how that's been adapted and the way in which work has changed and shifted. Actually, probably, Mahesh, you want to come in and give some experience from your perspective in Thailand and Samsung?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alex. As you mentioned, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. We're currently working for a Korean conglomerate with Samsung, I've definitely seen these types of metrics, et cetera, firsthand. So I think even pre-COVID, the challenge, there was always a need for FaceTime, being in the office, putting in the hours, and then we always, in terms of the evaluation criteria for the work that we do, it's looking at it from a team-based or a subsidiary-based perspective rather than an individual basis for the accomplishment there. And definitely, as you mentioned, Alex, I think the proximity that we are to the more senior management, et cetera, is more, it provides more influence to get things done compared to maybe where you sit in the organizational structure formally. So I think those are definitely some of the key aspects. As you mentioned, in Southeast Asia or East Asia, actually even here in Thailand, this was one of the first countries that actually had a COVID case outside of China back in early 2020. And the way that Asia and East Asia approached COVID was very, it was a very quick response, and it was immediate containment. So shutting down, putting in quarantine measures, et cetera. And what was interesting was that even though the countries themselves would put down those measures, the companies did not adopt the same rules or regulations. So for Samsung, for example, it took many months to get to the point of maybe even setting up the work from home or remote work, primarily because I think that concept was still a little bit foreign to in how they would make that work, given that the work culture was mainly FaceTime based and in person in the office, and not so much in terms of remote work, et cetera. However, I think the companies have adjusted over time, and I see that even the Korean conglomerates and even the companies here in Thailand, for example, have adopted a lot of the Western rules or the Western behaviors around providing incentives or providing this work from home environment. So it's definitely changing, but when we look back initially, it took some time for these companies to sort of move towards maybe what came a little bit more naturally or a little bit quicker in the West. Now, saying that, I would also have a different perspective, which is, as I think Alex mentioned, this primarily focuses around some of the white collar jobs. But when we look at some of the jobs that might be more service-based, in terms of even here in Samsung Thailand, we work a lot with our retailers, our retail partners, who have to stay open even during the times when we had COVID restrictions. The dynamic of how we approach consumers has changed. So we typically have, for example, salespeople that are employed by Samsung in our retail partners that directly interact with consumers that have to be in the store in order to drive the sales, because that's how their incentives are based. But when we had our second and third waves of COVID, when the government rules got more stricter and stricter here, and they started shutting down shops, we had to also sort of pivot and enable these individuals who would sell directly to end consumers in the store to also sell online. So we had to approach the consumer from a different perspective. So I think it's, there's definitely a perspective of how companies approach, maybe from a white collar perspective, working in the office, et cetera. But I think also the role or the function, the functional perspective also drives a little bit of differences in terms of how we need to approach work, because if you're incentivized based on the sales you have to make, and the sales you make have to happen, we're primarily taking place in person in the store, and that whole dynamic changes to becoming more online, then we also have to pivot, or we need to help those functions pivot so that we can help retain those employees and also help them be successful wherever they're based. I'll hand it over back to you, Alex, to
No,
continue.
thanks, Mahesh. It's a great perspective to have something, a different view and how that works with the promoters as well. So one thing I want to just talk about that on that point is to talk about how, this remote work or work from home, if again, from that perspective of being white collar, we're talking about people who are going into the workforce, graduating from the university perspective, what does that look like in terms of how to craft from an organizational structure, this culture and this business strategy? And so what we find out is that there's a problem that businesses have, right? A few of them being, one is rewarding top talent. And at the moment that we see this great resignation being portrayed across the news, right? How people are leaving. Well, it's the fact that it's hard to keep top talent into a position if you're not able to reward them and make sure they're, addressing and performing and to show them that they're valued. The second one is managing profit. Looking at the personnel, generally speaking, and I think that everyone here can speak to this as managing their P&Ls, is that, you have the, line items and method control for finance is the fact that when you look at your salaries and benefits, that people are often looked at as a line item as an expense instead of looking at them and how they could be leveraged and how you would be able to leverage them as assets. And then lost productivity of being people who are, when they leave a job, being able to make sure you're able to backfill that work that's been vacated in terms of being able to make sure that there are people who are covering for that and getting someone in as a big cost of associated with that. So all of these are big problems that exist within this concept of remote work, making sure that you're able to retain people, reward them, and make sure that you're attracting the right people to work within this current confine of this dynamic of remote work. And the real reason and opportunities to kind of change that, going back into, again, what Daria was talking about in terms of culture, you were able to update the culture to make sure that the work from home or the remote work becomes a part of the culture to enhance flexibility. Sometimes it's coming into work once or twice a week into the office or on campus. And so those are things that we've already seen actively within certain things in the way that's being implemented. Being able to reduce overhead with by this office on demand model is a way that a lot of companies have been addressing it. So in the next few years, we'll look and see how the landscape will change from a corporate real estate perspective of the need for maintaining office space in central parts of cities where with a lot of organizations. And then lastly, virtual connectivity, making sure that people are connected and have job satisfaction in a place. So I'm gonna pop through a few, one of which, my firm has been doing this since probably end of 2019 because we have an office in Korea. But just kind of touching base, and our firm is a investment and consulting entity. So part of our business is advisory as well as doing placements. And so we've been able to work across with 20 employees across the different countries. And basically, throughout this entire process, we've had to adapt and have been adapting, still adapting and working remotely. And through the point, the main piece being mentioned is that we've been able to close investments. As you've seen, that there's been a number of companies that have been able to close investments, to conduct due diligence in terms of corporate development products that companies that have been able to make placements into businesses and acquisitions of companies. And so that's no different. We're smaller, much smaller, but it was still something that was necessitated with a situation and still is. And then these numbers actually are changing as we talk about this now. But the reason why I bring that up is just to talk about one of the ways that some of the industries can change. They've been changing across the board, but particularly for people talking about, again, Miami, we don't often think about it, but has a lot of private equity, a lot of corporate development in the just within the area of FIU. And basically it's an example of how leverage tech and relationships in order to execute due diligence in a place. And of course, this has changed for consulting, traveling Monday through Thursday into different places in systems engineering, and as you change, how do you update and are able to implement new IT solutions, new supply chain or solutions for different corporations. But effectively, the case in point is that due diligence, when it comes down to M&A, used to be something that we looked at that need to be on site. You need to go and see to get a feel for the company. You need to talk to people. And some of those things are still true. You still do need to talk to people and engage with them, but the way in which that due diligence is manifesting itself has changed significantly. And one of which is leveraging technology for not just for conducting interviews, doing demos and site visits. You're able to actually sell using an online channel like Mahesh was talking about, taking people, again, that location, putting people in the place where they need to go is how you're able to push that through. And you're able to evaluate all of the different capabilities that way and be rather effective at doing so between the managing, understanding the fit, getting a feel for the team, the product, being hands-on, and also understanding what people's values and their goals are. And this is something that I think we'll see on maintain and be established in the long run as we look forward to how this effort will change in the future in terms of due diligence. And the last thing I'll say, just in terms of COVID provided one other thing about this, regardless if COVID happens or not, is actually making sure that we're able to be very, very careful and making sure that we're prepared for various challenges, various threats that can actually impact the business, right? And so there's a concept of something called COOP planning, which is continuity of operations and ensuring that you have operational resilience, right? And that's something that we've experienced in the US broadly during COVID, not having access to certain supplies that would have that would help you navigate such a crisis, right? But as corporate companies, it's important to do that too, right? And so effectively, there's a few things just to ask yourself to make sure if there's a challenge. One is make sure that there's a RACI matrix to understand who's responsible and accountable for all the different activities that are necessary in such a situation like this. Making sure that there's a protocol in place to make sure that you know who is authorized to validate and improve different mechanisms, right? With everything, if there's a system outage and you aren't able to communicate, cyber threat that takes down a company's mainframe and system, how do you communicate? How can you make sure that ships are still moving from the port of LA across the ocean? I mean, these are different things that are important to understand. And lastly, how would you leverage? What systems do you use when things are down, and how do you able to navigate that, and who has access to those systems? So all of those different things, I think, are lessons that we've learned, and just to make sure that we're able to operate more resiliently across the board. So that's some of the things that we're looking forward to learning and making sure that we're ready for the next disaster that comes up. So I did want to leave some time for Q&A. So Boz, Jillian, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, we don't have any questions. I'm very surprised we don't have questions in the Q&A box. Please feel free to add your questions. But as we're talking, since we're nearing the end, I'm going to launch the poll, but we can still have a conversation. I thought it might be really interesting to hear from Mahesh about the differences in working, like the work dynamic in Korea, as opposed to how it is in Thailand, and how it is in the US, and kind of the differences in that. I think that would be interesting to hear about.
Sure, Jillian, happy to address that question. I think we had a brief chat about that earlier, but sorry, excuse me. Yeah, so I think as Alex had written in the previous slide, I think there's definitely a large difference between how we approach work in the West versus how we approach work in the East. I think it tends to be, well, from my time in Korea, it tended to be a lot more top-down driven versus I tended to see more flatter organizations in the West, in the US, compared to the large Korean conglomerates. Decision makings at the Korean conglomerates typically, you know, you might suggest or indirectly provide input into what you think the right approach is, but the final decision maker is always at the top. And until that person you get the go ahead, you don't see things move. But the moment that the individual, the most senior individual gives the okay, everything moves super quickly, very, very quickly in order to get executed. So that's sort of the dynamic that we see in Korea. I think I mentioned earlier that when I look at working in a Korean company in Thailand, the culture, the Thai culture and the Korean cultures are quite there. There are some similarities, but also a lot of differences. So when we're working in the work environment, I would say actually one of the language or one of the words that we use in Korea, pali pali, it means quick, which means that moment a decision is made, everyone's executing super quickly, as I mentioned before. But in Thailand, there's a saying sabai sabai, which means relax. So again, not to generalize and put everyone in the same bucket, but definitely there's a difference in the mentality of how work is approached. And I think that translates also to this whole how the companies approached COVID and here in Thailand. So I noticed that a lot of the Western multinationals very quickly moved towards a work from home environment, or even maybe initially a rotational base, like 50% in the office, 50% out, but then quickly moved towards more longer term work from home. Thai companies also tended to move quickly to work from home. The culture is quite conservative in terms of, I would say, the approach to managing these large scale challenges or environmental changes. And so, you know, you look at how the country itself approached the pandemic. There was a quick shutdown of all the borders, quarantine processes in place. And it was quite similar across many other countries in Asia in order to protect the population. And we saw that the Thai companies also sort of followed in those footsteps. However, it was very interesting to see that Korean companies were acted a little bit differently in the sense that the office was still open. My Korean colleagues would still go into the office on a ongoing basis, and I actually ended up doing so myself. As I said, I think that proximity and the FaceTime does provide a lot of that influence beyond the organizational structure itself. But even in Korea, when I speak to my colleagues who are back in the headquarters, the offices remained open over there, even though, you know, again, they tried to manage the pandemic so that the government was managing it well. The offices were still remained open, and only when there were specific cases they would maybe evacuate that particular floor, things like that. But they would never say the entire office go work from home. And I think part of the reason is also, as Alex had mentioned, the shift towards working from home, or that transition period, I think just did not exist. That 2010 to 2020, where there was more of a shift in the US, becoming more flexible in terms of the workspace, et cetera. That shift, I think, just never took place fully in Korea. And it was only the pandemic that I think really accelerated that process. So even though they were sort of maybe a little bit late in adopting some of those work from home policies, I think now it's more acceptable and much more, and the systems and processes are in place to enable that. type of remote work environment. Similarly, here in Thailand, here in Samsung Thailand, it was only very recently, I'd say April, that we actually started a majority of the office working from home at that point. So it did take some time, but now I think we're also adopting the same processes.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Yeah, we just have about another minute or so. I don't know if anybody wanted to add anything additional. Alex, Daria? I wanted to say a huge thank you to you all. It was very insightful. I really appreciated hearing all of your perspectives on this interesting topic. And definitely if any of the attendees have questions that come up, definitely send them my way and we'll try to get them answered. And we'll also have a recording of this webinar as well. So thank you very much. And I hope you have a wonderful week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.